channel. This is the first video of a series called Meet the Pros. In this series, I will be interviewing people in the field of biology and genetics to help high school students interested in biology. In today's episode, I will be interviewing Mr. Joshua Sham. He is my biology teacher at the Peddie School in Hightstown, and I'm delighted to have him with me here today. Thank you for being here, Mr. Sham.
Of course, excited to be here.
Thank you. Okay, so I want to start with something that most high schoolers are probably thinking about, which is their futures in college and what path they would choose. So, could you tell us how you first became interested in biology and why you chose to teach over the industry?
Yeah, it's a great question. It was in high school. I had this awesome science teacher actually for physics. And one of the things I loved about the class is it was very hands-on. We were going outside and studying projectile motion. Everything was some type of demonstration. And so his class really sparked my interest in science. It was really the first class in high school where I felt like I thoroughly enjoyed and looked forward to,
Mhm.
which prompted me to continue that exploration into my senior year and then into college. And once I started taking classes in college, I realized that biology was certainly more a greater interest for me. Um, I spent a lot of college kind of exploring various different options, and I did some volunteering in the dental field. I did observations in surgery. I observed people in the cancer wards. I observed pediatrics and spent a lot of time in hospitals in particular. And throughout the course of that experience, I realized that being in the hospital setting wasn't really for me. I felt like it was a little bit too dreary, a little bit too morbid, unfortunately. But I still really appreciated and loved the science. And I had worked at a summer camp for a while, and so I decided to kind of merge the two and working with students, and then my interest in science. And I gave teaching a shot, and when I first decided to apply as a science teacher, I wasn't sure that that's something that I'd be doing for a while, but you kind of fall into a rhythm and you enjoy what you're doing. And so that's kind of how I fell in where I am.
Did you ever consider like research? Um, it may not have had to be like the medical field, like being a doctor, but how about just research?
Yeah, so while I was doing some of those opportunities in college, there were two research experiences that I had. One research was with a hemophilia center, studying menorrhagia and collecting data on um, menorrhagia is a disorder that affects women and the intensity of their periods in the menstrual cycle. And a lot of that was data collection. And then I did some behavioral studies when I was in college where I was collecting data on students' kind of behavior in relation to their amount of television that they consume. I've never worked in a biotechnology lab other than the one that I run here at Peddie for specific courses, but it's never actually really crossed my mind. I think that for me, the human element of things was more of a draw. And so if I was going to go into the medical field or the field of biology, a lot of it would be working with people.
Yeah.
And so I've done my fair share of labs. I've while in college and while teaching, but it's never been something I've even really considered.
hmm Um, what would be your advice to high school students interested in biology? Specifically, like what could they do outside of school courses? Like how you mentioned that you did a lot of volunteering and observational work, in
Yeah,
like labs and everything.
oh, yeah, of course. I think to start, using summers wisely is really important.
hmm
I think there are a lot of opportunities that are designed for high school students, and these opportunities allow students to explore something beyond what they'd be able to do in the classroom. It's hard to get into some of them without some biology background, and so it usually doesn't happen until after the sophomore year.
Yeah.
But these programs really do expose kids to great science opportunities where they are taking what they're learning and they're applying it in the field. And these vary across different disciplines, and so you could see them in the field of biotechnology, where you are doing things like polymerase chain reaction, which of course everyone knows about now, gel electrophoresis, so on and so forth. Or you could be collecting data in the field of ecology, or in marine science, if that is something that's a little more interesting to you, actually being out there in the ocean collecting samples. And so I think that it's really important in high school, not necessarily to define what it is you want to do or specifically what it is you want to explore, but to have experiences that help you to shape that, to help you to get a little bit closer to move in that direction. Now, I've had kids that have done various programs over the course of high school where they have decided this is what I want to do with my career. I've
Mhm.
also had other students who have done research and decided that they don't want to go near science ever again.
Mhm.
And both of those things are great,
Yeah.
because they're one step closer to figuring out what it is that they want to do.
Mhm.
Because at the end of the day, as much as I would like all my science students to
Yeah.
go into the science field, it's not reasonable,
Mhm.
So I think that there is a lot of value in realizing that maybe something isn't for you or that there's an element of something that you appreciate and to try and kind of tailor things from there to make adjustments and find other opportunities. I think the summer work is really important. I think that taking opportunities with schools when they're offered, right? So various different clubs and guest speakers and things like that.
Mhm.
Um, I also think that depending on the school, there are programs that involve internship work
Yeah.
throughout the year, and I think that stuff is really valuable. But getting as much exposure as possible in as many different fields within the realm of science, I think will help you to really hone in on what it is you want to explore.
Mhm. Aside from just summer programs, is it possible for high school students to have meaningful interactions with companies or even universities, say if they want like an internship or anything?
Yeah, I think the internship thing is very feasible, especially in the university level.
Hmm.
Um, you know, the good thing is about universities, people are there because they want to
Yeah,
educate,
yeah.
right? And so even though a lot of professors at universities are doing research, they also believe strongly in the educational piece. And so, um, certainly at our school, we have that internship program, STEM EXP, that allows students
Yeah.
to try and find opportunities in laboratories, in various different types of laboratories across the country, around the world. But I think that's very accessible. I think that trying to find opportunities that are internship based beyond the universities or science specific institutions can be difficult. So what I mean by that is like if you wanted to go work for a pharmaceutical company,
Yeah.
interning with someone there that is a
Hmm.
biochemist, that's going to be a little bit harder for you to
Yeah.
do. But if it's an institution that does scientific research and that's like their sole focus, and it's not like maybe a profit-driven institution in the same way that
Hmm. Hmm.
pharmaceutical companies could be,
Yeah.
um, those are pretty open to having high school students join,
Hmm.
as they should be, because at the
Yeah.
end of the day, you want this pipeline to be sustainable. We want to have future scientists, and we live in a world right now where the science is what's going to keep humanity living at the quality of life that we have currently, right? We
Yeah.
need
Yeah.
to make adjustments. And so people who are into the sciences need to be supported. And I think people who are currently in the field realize that and are willing to support that. And so anyone that's young and is looking to break in, you should be able to do so. But as I
Hmm.
said, it can be a little bit more difficult if it's a company as opposed to like an organization or university.
Okay. Are there any books that you could recommend for high schoolers? Like I know you talked about Sapiens, which I did get from the library, but things that are maybe more rooted to genetics or other disciplines.
Yeah, I think that so if I was thinking about books that I've read specific to science, I think that recently, certainly I like Sapiens because Sapiens talks
Hmm.
about the overall history, even though of the world, even though
Yeah.
that's not entirely science focused. Only really the first few chapters are based in science.
Hmm.
Um, One of my favorite books that I've read um, about more about evolution is called Thumbs, Toes, and Tears.
Hmm.
I think it's a really excellent read. I think it gives perspective as to why we are
The way
human.
we are.
Yeah, what are things that make us make us have these characteristics and allows us to understand kind of where we came from. Um, I think that Henrietta Lacks's book, I think it's The Immortal Cells of Henrietta Lacks. Can't remember off the top of my head. It's a
Hmm.
really great one as well,
Yeah.
talking about her unique situation and the way in which her cells acted and interacted differently than other people's cells when in the laboratory. So I think that's a pretty interesting one. Um, yeah, no, there's a lot out there. There's a lot out there. Certainly, reading Origin of Species, I think is important for anyone to understand kind of a lot of the foundational stuff in biology, and understanding kind of Darwin's voyage. Um, Off the top of my head, that's probably what I have. If I was standing in front of my bookshelf,
Yeah.
it'd be a little easier
Yeah.
for me right now. Of
Okay. And I also want to ask you a more like biology oriented question.
course.
So, what are your opinions on the future of gene editing, specifically in terms of like the ethical concerns surrounding it and like what people think the potential dangers of?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So I think that ultimately gene editing is going to be really important in terms of solving disease.
Yeah.
Being able to change people's genomes in order to allow for different gene expression that results in, different proteins that are being produced, replacing certain proteins that ultimately lead to disease. That
Yeah.
is a huge step forward in our abilities to do some of those things. And while some of them are still relatively new, others have been around for some years. CRISPR, for one, is a great technology that's being used to try and alter genomes and solve some of these diseases.
Hmm.
Um, I think that there are lines with everything,
Yeah.
that making, you know, to what extent can, if you know a child, or if you know that if you know parents are going to have a certain disorder with that kid, for instance, if they're going to have something like Tay-Sachs.
Yeah.
Tay-Sachs is a disorder that leads to lipid buildup in the brain, and ultimately kids don't live past the age of 3 or 4. Well, of course, maybe we can try and make some adjustments,
Hmm.
before the zygote develops or before fertilization, in an effort to ensure that Tay-Sachs isn't there.
Yeah.
That makes sense. But then what happens when you take that one step further? When you're like, oh, well, I want to make sure that um, my kid is going to be taller because their life will
Hmm.
be easy as a result of being taller, right? And so it winds up becoming this kind of gray area where it can get pretty dark, actually,
Yeah.
in terms of um, what sometimes people describe as like designer babies and making
Hmm.
adjustments.
Hmm.
I think that I think it's really important to look at it in terms of um, preventing disease, but I think personally beyond that, it becomes somewhat of a kind of eugenics experiment.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't really think that that's where we want to go with
No,
this
not
technology.
at all. Not at all.
Yeah. So I think it's a great question. And I think that
Mhm.
um, do I believe that in the future, when this technology becomes more readily available, that there will be people in this world that will try to manipulate it? Probably, yeah.
Yeah.
But I think at present, it's doing some really great stuff in terms of trying to prevent disease.
Hmm. Yeah. And finally, I want to end with a sort of fun question. If you could bring back any extinct species, which one would you bring back and why? And you cannot say dinosaurs.
Okay, well, that's the easy question for me actually, because I have a favorite
Oh,
extinct
okay.
species. So
Mhm.
it is the thylacine.
Okay.
Uh, the thylacine is a Tasmanian tiger, and it was probably the size of like I don't know, 40 to 60 pound dog.
Okay.
It only had stripes on its lower back and into its rear.
Mhm.
Had this like remarkable ability to open its mouth like 100 and I don't know, 40 degrees.
Okay.
But they're just super interesting looking animals, and they were endangered, and a lot of them were kept in captivity and not managed well in the early, in the 1920s and 1930s, and they
Yeah.
actually went up going extinct as a result of mismanagement and overhunting. So they were around for a very long time, up until about 100 years ago. The really cool thing about it, and you can go do a deep dive on the internet if you'd like, is that there's supposedly sightings of them in the wild.
Oh,
So they're not like confirmed,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
but it's one of these things where people hunted them and they were like a prize to find, and now in reflection upon reflection, people in that area are really wishing they still existed. So the thylacine, super cool animal. Look it up. Look
Yeah,
up the
I will
history.
definitely.
So yeah,
Yeah, okay. All right. Well, I think we're running out of time, so I want to thank Mr. Sham for being here and especially being my first interviewee. Yeah.
yeah, of course. Yeah, appreciate being here. Thanks for having me, Rishi.
Okay. All right. Bye, everyone.